Okay, here we are looking at Decision Games Modern War magazine, Axis of Evil. They call it that on the magazine. It's Axis of Evil Iran. That's the name on the game. It's kind of a funny one. I entered it not really knowing what to think. Early on, had a lot of kind of gripes about it. But I've warmed to it quite a bit. I was considering whether to play additional scenarios. It has, and whether or not I could, create a scenario to try to handle the modern situation. Honestly, given what I saw of the scenario I saw, the idea of like a full-on U.S. intervention. Look, Iran they can't resist it, right? The only question is, does the United States have, the the fortitude to enter into another quagmire type war? Because this game does not cover that kind of extended situation, but we could grab their fucking coast. There's almost no question of that. We have air superiority already, which is the important thing in the game. But anyway, what I was saying was there's a number of different scenarios here, and 6 of them in total. I played one. Each of them is a little different. There's also a fair amount of randomness in the way the game initially is set up. The most important piece being who controls Iraq, because Iraq is worth like 9 victory points, and that 9 victory points going away from one player to another player is a pretty big jump. I think with very competent play, so if the game is at all balanced, whoever gets Iraq wins. Right, unless there's some factor in play, like one player is significantly better or worse than the other. But then, if the situation is balanced, if the game itself is balanced and the players are balanced, that's fine. But I think the game isn't balanced, and that was one of my worries for my playthrough. I can't be absolutely certain about this, because first of all, I only played it once, but I also played it solitaire, and there's at least one aspect of the game that has some importance to it that doesn't really come across all that well playing solitaire, which is the bidding of special forces units. It's a secret bid. You can bluff whatever, and we saw some of the mechanisms of it in play towards the end of the game. And then there's another thing, which is there were a lot of different avenues I didn't go down. My play was hampered by my imagination, and I think that there are actually a lot of different ways you can go about trying to play this. I went with what looked like the most reasonable choices at various times, obviously, but I might not be seeing something. However, my impression is that NATO's capability to get air superiority is greater than what the Eurasian Union, the EU, that one sticks in my craw. What the Ruskies and their proxies, because that's really what this is. This game is, if you took the Russians out of this game and tried to play something like U.S. Dealing with Iran, it's not much of a contest. Although the U.S. does not have many forces that are really U.S. So the contingent that's in play there is NATO. And NATO among other things, implies some pretty hefty Turkish units that are present, including one hyperwar unit. I'll get into that in a bit. I've got a lot to say about this, I think. And then, who knows what the rest of them are? They're not all U.S., but for the most part, the air and naval components that really matter, that are going to dominate this situation, those are U.S. units. One of the big things. Let me switch pipes. I'll get to it. All right, back to that. So one of the big things which kind of gets my goat about this game is it's really hard to figure out when and where it's set. Part of that is the level of abstraction in it. It was written in 2019. You feel like it should be in the really near future, within the next couple of years. So it should be almost out of date at this point, right? Except it's assuming things that feel like way too much of a stretch. Now the design comes from the original game in the series, and there's like 3 of them total, I think, maybe more. So it was popular, right? The original design of the... Oh, you know what I saw? It's just going off on a tangent. Apparently they're redoing, yet again, the entire Central Front series, but with different mechanisms and whatnot. It's probably out by now or whatever. That would have been an intriguing thing to might have been worth getting a subscription to get the whole thing. Then again, it might just suck compared to what the original is, because they're completely rewriting it, right? Like, it's not the same game system, but they're also basing it on new information going back. Those are just, fantasy situations, right? I mean, this is a fantasy situation too, but it's one that presumably could have happened when this was written. The idea of going back and saying, what if there had been a Soviet invasion of Western Europe? I don't know, there wasn't. And it just, while I enjoyed playing Central Front series, that felt like more of a nostalgia thing. I don't know that I would really get the same kick out of playing a big what if from, I don't know. It's one thing to play silly little ones that are one-offs and whatnot, but the idea of investing, I think it's again, five games in. I think that's what they were committing to. 5 games in terms of replaying a Cold War what if. I don't know. But the fact that there's a lot more knowledge about it does make it more interesting in some ways. Anyway, wow, went off on a sidetrack there. Yeah, so the situation here, in 2019, Russia is not an impressive country at that point. And even this magazine, and to some extent the game, shows their military as, not some kind of match for NATO at all. At least from what I played. And actual historical events show, with their real invasion of Ukraine, showed that, wow, they were really something of a paper tiger when it came down to it. I mean, their army just collapsed in that first invasion. Now they're learning their lessons again. They're learning how to fight World War I again, with drones. But it definitely wasn't the kind of shock and awe that it felt like it was going to be when they first rolled into Ukraine. Anyway, And we shouldn't be surprised, you know? I mean, if you think about things like the Chechen War, of course, that was a long time ago, but compare the capabilities, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The U.S.'s big problem was we would never commit the troops. Like, we never threw the forces into Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. We never threw the kind of forces in that we would have needed to defeat a country of that size and to just overwhelm it World War II style. It feels like Russia's kind of trying to do that. It's a little on the cheap, but it's not as, you know, as worried about public opinion as we would be in the U.S. And honestly, you know, even with the madman in chief, there are limits to what he could do. You know, if he threw troops in, Congress might just find that they have at least like some spine somewhere. Maybe, I don't know. Obviously, Lindsey Graham wouldn't. He'll bend over any which way to get that nutsack in his mouth. Anyway. Oh, what a lovely image. Oh, God. But, yeah, so the whole sort of premise of this game is based on a series of different conflicts in which Russia and the U.S. are the main opponents of each other. None of the scenarios lack that, right? There's nothing there's no limited war type stuff that's really limited. Like, the presumptions are that NATO will put a small amount of force. We're not talking total war here. We're talking probably something along the lines of what went into Iraq or what went into Afghanistan. Well, not so much Afghanistan, I think, but what went into Iraq in terms of real military units doing real things, but not a full national war footing. And, you know, the Russians fully intervening as well. That's a fantasy scenario, man. Much, much more likely is the kind of thing that's happening right now. Very limited involvement from one side, and actually in both wars, in Ukraine and in Iran, very limited involvement by the side trying to hurt itself by going to war, and that's true with both sides. Although Putin at least had a more reasonable shot of achieving regime change with the information he had, and what he was willing to do. Against the proxy of their real enemy, right? Now, Russia still understands that the U.S. is their real enemy. They're trying to hurt us by ripping NATO from us. But they understand that it's the U.S. involvement everywhere. Look, Western Europe isn't sticking its fingers in every fucking pie, right? It's the goal, perhaps, of Putin's expansion is at the expense of the EU, you know, taking back territories that were within Russia's sphere of influence. But, you know, the U.S. had a sphere of influence that covered the world, right? And now it's like we're kind of saying, you can have this, you know? Just let us indulge in our own adventurism, but with a lot less reason behind it. Anyway, the idea in the game of Russia and the U.S. being involved in a limited war that they directly are conflicting with each other, man, that's really hard to believe. Like, that is not going to happen at the level that this game portrays. It's either going to keep escalating or, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, some limited engagement might not happen, that starts to look like it's tipping things over. But if that happens, it's either going to escalate really bad, or some kind of ceasefire is going to happen, and they're going to try to work out how to prevent it from escalating, how to prevent it from happening at all. The war just won't, it won't go on like it does in this game, like for a couple of weeks where actual Russian and NATO forces are actually engaging each other. And, you know, if it did start happening in Iran, it would mean that invasion of Western Europe would happen, right? Like, well, I say Western Europe. It would be an invasion of Eastern Europe, really, by the Russians. But it would go all out, and it would probably end up, in a nuclear World War III. Probably. Just because of the way tit for tat works. And if you saw my play of NATO, you can see why. One side or the other gets the advantage. Well, time to risk it all, So, we've got that piece. We've got another piece that's a little weird, which is we've got these hyperwar units. It's not absolutely clear. It doesn't define what they are in the game, in the notes, whatever is provided in here. I had to look up online what hyperwar even meant. It feels like, the way I found the definition, it means units that are basically autonomous mechanical stuff. So we're talking a drone army. We're talking big units now without human control over them. And the reason that's really important and fits into this is because it allows for this tremendous command and control capability, that anything that's going through chains of command and human decision-making processes is going to be slower and is going to introduce more friction than the ideal of this automated thing. Well, we're clearly nowhere near that. To the extent that, like, right now, yeah, maybe air stuff of that nature is going to be in play in 5 years. So, we're talking ogre type stuff here, by which I mean the old Steve Jackson game with the automated tanks and stuff. In the ideal, we're talking stuff where human intelligence is not coming into the issue. I've got to swap batteries. I'll be back. And in terms of how the game's mechanisms work, that almost makes sense, right? The way the game's mechanisms work is you pay action points and I'll get into this. It's a cool system in terms of play. You pay action points in terms of in order to activate any unit. You're allowed one action, and then the other guy gets an action. It's not necessarily one action point, but to move a standard unit, it eats up a single action and an action point, and then you can move a unit, and then the opponent can react by moving a unit. But with the hyperwar units, it costs one action point and one action, and you can move all your hyperwar units using the same type of movement. I'm not sure why there's the same type of movement restriction in there, to tell you the truth, but anyway, that feels very much like sort of a hive mind type thing, some kind of advantage that, like, the bugs in Starship Troopers should have or something. And that matches very nicely to this concept of the entirely automated army. But we ain't anywhere near that, right? Like, we're not going to see that in 5 years, I think. And we're certainly not going to see that back in 2019. Now, in 2019, maybe it seemed like it was 5 years away, and now it seems like it's 5 years away. There's a funny way of things happening that way. So I'm not going to judge it as Well, those 5 years didn't happen, whatever. Yeah, they didn't, but it's a projection type thing. But again, we're not going to see that in 5 years. So what I'm looking at is, okay, well, what could it be trying to say? And again, it's not well defined. The definition I found online talks about, these autonomous automated systems making all the decisions. Now, maybe that's something like a coordination being handled by AI or whatever, and that the idea is that the computers that link in, the software that links in and whatever, this game is right at the edge of when that is being developed, and that a quicker command and control situation is being performed. A lot of hand waving to get to some way of arguing why we would be able to move a whole bunch of stuff very, very easily that's marked hyperwar, but not be able to move most of the regular integrated units of either the Russian or US or NATO armies. So that feels like kind of a fantasy element to me, okay? Something that's not grounded in that this is what, a war right when this game was being designed would look like. Now, unfortunately, 3 years after this game was designed, Russia got itself tied up in something where there's no way, like even if this fantasy existed in terms of Russia being willing, let's say the U.S. made a strike against Iran, Russia being willing to deploy troops directly in, and the U.S. and Russia involving themselves in ground and air combat operations against one another. Russia just wouldn't. They weren't able to throw themselves into the Syrian civil war at the end. They lost their puppet there. Still, that's not getting a lot of news, and I don't really know what's going on there. I really should have taken a closer look, but anyway. So that's a couple of things that just really hit me in terms of the sort of scenario and the context that the game provides itself. It's not based in a reality of the time that it was written, and it's less based on now, but it's also hard to see what they were trying to express with it. Again, I'm looking at maybe 10 years in the future, yet they make this assumption that Syria and Iraq are still in these chaotic situations and haven't really progressed beyond where they were in 2019, right? And that's the other thing. It's like you're making this fantasy situation in terms of what the capabilities are, yet you're just saying the rest of the world has stayed pretty much frozen in the same, and it's just hard to believe. Make something up whole cloth in fantasy if you're going to. So that premise of Russia and the NATO forces conflicting directly on this kind of not a global war, and certainly not a nuclear war, but also willing to continue the same level, sort of moderately low level of conflict in the air, in the cyberspace, in the actual on the ground even. The only reason that kind of makes some sense to me is if you take those hyperwar units and say, look, this is the development by both sides of some really new capabilities that allow them incredible advantages for small amounts of units, and one side or the other decides here's the tripwire, we want to try it. They're surprised to find out the other side has the same kind of capabilities as well, maybe at a different level, and because I think NATO has stronger hyperwar than the Russians do. They also have stronger air power, which means that they win. That's my view on it. I may be wrong. But that new technology is essentially allowing for this weird sort of direct engagement between Russia and the U.S. that's not going to blow up into something bigger. Now, again, it feels fantasy, it feels unbelievable, but that's sort of the premise that I can try to put together that makes it make sense. And it really doesn't work in any other way. So, like, it's not like this is just hacking and cutting off orders or something. Look, one side or the other, this is one of the big problems I have with the game, is it covers the air war in a reasonably detailed way, where one side or the other is going to get air superiority by engaging their fighters and their missiles and whatnot, and eventually degrading the other guy's air power enough that, yes, they can keep putting things out there, maybe, but you will eventually knock out their actual planes and they won't be able to put them out anymore. And one side or the other will get the air superiority and will have that big advantage. Now, I think the game skews in favor of the U.S. for that, in terms of giving them more air power capability. But it's possible that the Russians could win that, especially if they have the initiative and get some good die rolls, whatever. There's no corresponding cyber superiority. I feel like there should be. I feel like that's what's missing here. Instead of these hyperwar units, it feels like the side that wins the cyber superiority should be able to get something similar to the hyperwar command and control advantage once they completely knock out the other side's communications capabilities. And that should be another set of assets. So it feels like the wrong game was designed here, right? Like, this hyperwar units feels like it's taking the place of something that would have been a lot more believable, which is being able to denigrate. That's not the right word. I don't know. I don't know what word I want to use. Maybe it is. The command and control capabilities of the other side. Similar to that, and maybe at a third level, is space. Space! Which I don't have an echo mic, I'm sorry. Which the cyber side could prevent the communications with the satellites and whatnot, but it looks like space is also becoming armed enough that the idea of actually directly attacking one another's satellite assets would be a factor in something along this lines. Again, that kind of, once you're hitting across those broad different layers, and you have ground troops involved in everything, I feel like it's going to go nuclear. But let's just pretend that the nuclear doesn't happen to make the game interesting. I think another side would be, there would basically be two mechanisms to be able to get under the command and control side of things. One of which is a cyber side of things, and maybe it's all integrated. The cyber and the space warfare is all a single thing. But something like the air superiority game ought to be being played in the cyber realm. Then get rid of these hyperwar units and just say that certain nationalities, contingents is what they put them as, NATO, the Russians, have, and maybe there's some units that align with those, Israel, that these would have a capability to operate as the hyperwar units in this game do, with a much tighter cycle of command and control, the decision cycle, and being able to react the way the hyperwar units do, but across the entire contingent. It's not like, it's not like it takes a hell of a lot of specialized extra training and everything, and that it just turned out that we only taught the Marines, the airborne, and this one corps or two corps how to utilize their equipment to be able to tag into the command and control capabilities over the computer. I feel like that level of command and control is in existence in all armies, and now the question is who and what is able to break into it. And as I brought up in the other in earlier videos, Russia can't really try to take that advantage on Ukraine because Ukraine is relying on Starlink, and Starlink is owned by a U.S. company, and so the real way to cripple the command and control is through political means in that particular case, right? There's been attempts, right? Starlink was taken away from Ukraine for a while. Russia was allowed to be using it for a while. I'm sure they have their own capabilities, but maybe Starlink is more advanced and more usable for them because they were using it and then it was taken away. But yeah, there's just not the capability to take down the command and control capacity. So I've been talking a lot without getting to the game itself very much. I mean, I'm dancing around the shoulders, but really, a lot of what my gripe here has to do with what those decisions of what the game would be and the fantasy scenario that came out of it. So let's start talking about the game. Let me start with components because that's easier, and then we can segue into the rules and the way the different systems work. Dumb map. So it's functional. I had a couple of little gripes. One is, and this is kind of clever, but the representation of the Kurdish areas is this hashing going through the terrain. And it makes it a little difficult to discern what the underlying terrain is. You get used to it. And it is a clever answer. Another problem that I have is this little star for the capital of Tehran. I think it's supposed to be in Tehran. It's not. Another one, the rail nets don't go through the cities. I think they're supposed to. If they don't, you can't actually rail things between two cities. You can rail from just outside one city outside another. Now, this is, like the capital thing, somewhat strangely inconsistent. So if we look, I don't know if you can see it, but this city here has the rail line going through it. Most of the cities do not. This city here has a rail line going partially into it. I just don't know, how to judge all that. And I can say one thing. There's no errata available on BGG, nor on WebGrognards. The Decision Games site seems to have disappeared. Maybe they've moved it, but that hasn't been updated on BGG. There are a few questions. There's no support for them from anyone. Feels like Decision Games is unwilling to support the game on BGG. They do maintain a Consim World thread, but that is the most ridiculous way to provide errata to anyone. The fact that no one has posted errata on BGG, usually people, who are in the know or whatever, are willing to move an errata sheet, a living rules, whatever. So my feeling is that Decision Games essentially doesn't support their games in any way that I can access. Wading through a CSW thread of questions, the same questions being asked again and again, and answers to them, hoping to find something and hoping that, it's consistent throughout, is ridiculous. So, yeah, I'm kind of the opinion that Decision Games doesn't really support their games fully enough. And they're a big company. They're a big company. I mean, not huge, not, maybe they're outclassed now by GMT and by Multiman, but they're a big player in the game space still. But they just seem to totally ignore BGG, and maybe all their players do too, or most of their players, which means if they are publishing this information or whatnot. We had one person respond to one of the questions with, yeah, I think that was answered in the CSW thread, and I think this was it. Not, nothing official, no cuts, clips, no errata being posted, nothing like that. Some of this may be because it's a magazine game. Decision Games puts out like multiple brands of magazine games. I don't know how many they put out a year in each one. I think this one is 6 a year. I'm not sure. It's either 4 or 6. But they have they've moved strategy and tactics. They've got a World War II one, the World at War. They've got this Modern War. They've got strategy and tactics for everything that's not World War II and modern. Modern is interesting because it covers basically anything after World War II. But anyway, so that's one facet. Is another thing that I don't really like about this is, and this is a mixed issue, but the amount of charts that are on the map, I would have much rather a smaller map with like a play aid. They're duplicating the same charts on both sides, which is helpful when you're playing opposed. It's not horrible, the whole thing, but I would rather have a play aid and not have to, because when you're looking at the map from one direction or another, right? It doesn't matter which one you are. But if you want to read this stuff, you got to turn sideways. And unfortunately, it's sideways where you have to look down the entire length of the map to see it, because, bottom is facing the map. It would make a lot more sense to be completely the other way, the way the player-aligned ones are. The player-aligned ones are facing away from the map so that they're easy to read by the player who's there. There's also these suckers. I found these boxes not to be sufficient, but also to be overkill. So it depends on the box. Coalition eliminated units, you don't even really need this. Some of the eliminated units count for victory points, some don't. You can just push them aside. You don't need a box for eliminated units particularly. I guess it's great when you're playing on Vassal, but, put it somewhere else. because the reinforcement and staging area boxes are not quite big enough, especially the reinforcement one. I found the Coalition reinforcement box held so that I could see what the counters were about 2/3 of the counters that I start the game with. Conceivably, the staging area could get filled up. I was okay with that. And then we have this U.S. 5th Fleet. There's another box like it somewhere else for the 6th Fleet. There's no box for the Russian one. This could honestly just be a little sliver, a little piece of the staging area, whatever. Basically, you've got one counter that can go in there. So yeah, the map had a lot of problems with it, many of which, and some of the rules, you have this variable control table at the beginning of the scenario. Some of the rules in that are really unclear. There's stuff that I feel like couldn't have gotten through playtesting without being mentioned. Now, I know that DG playtests their games. I've talked to someone who's a fan of their stuff, who's worked as a playtester for a while. He says they've gotten better. You know, their games have gotten better than in the horrible days of the 90s or whatever. But he also griped about how they sort of handle playtesters. They send them out their packet. If you send everything in time and all the information and everything, quite often they just don't address the things that are problematic. So, you know, I mean, it's great that they playtest. It's kind of fucking stupid that they don't actually utilize the information coming back with that. Some of that may be the magazine game publishing schedule. It's just a fact of life, you know. It's a hard turnaround to get magazine games out by their scheduled time, because you can't just say, all right, we're going to delay printing of this. You've got to have something to put in the magazine at that point. You know, it's not like you can just delay the game. You need something in there. And I mean, I'm not going to say there aren't ways of fixing that, but I'm going to say that does add an extra stressor, and I can see why they may often fail to get things corrected in time. One of the big ways to do that right is to make the pipeline longer, which is to say, don't even schedule a game for publication until it's damn near there, you know. And I see in this magazine they're scheduling games that they have, you know, nobody's working on yet. Basically, yeah, they're scheduling them a year out or whatever, but it's like software release, which is why software is buggy. Unfortunately, you can't patch the rules. I wanted to talk about something about the components that really did impress me, except that my battery's almost dead and we got to swap again. This is a super weird thing. But the rolls, see this little stain along here? Because the magazine is no longer, or I don't know, S&T's used to be, it doesn't have a stapled thing. They can't just staple the rules inside the middle anymore. So what did they use? They used a gummy type substance. Feels like those things you used to flick and they would stick to something and you could pull it. It's probably very much related to Post-it note material, the magic stuff from Post-it notes that comes from like some kind of chameleon or something that has sticky paws. It does leave this little stain. Who cares about that? But this is great. There can be a little staple on each of these. holding this together. I don't have to pry staples out, pull the magazine, pull the rolls out, and then maybe staple it together. I never did that. I just left my rolls loose. This is so cool. Advances in technology. And honestly, as soon as that technology became available for that sticky thing, would have been very cool to have wasted a couple of extra staples and had an inserted roll, even if the magazine itself was stapled together. But that's besides the point. It's just, wow, what a cool little thing. All right, since we're talking about the rolls themselves, I had a weird sort of trouble with these rolls. They're not perfect. There are places where there are contradictions, ambiguities, whatever. But they're very, very sparsely written, as if to, in a way that, makes it more parsimonious. It reduces the amount of space the game handles. In some ways, they worded things in weird sort of ways that I'm like, that's actually really clever. They saved a line of information or something like that in it by doing it that way. One thing there isn't is a lot of references. There's a lot of, there's not a lot of explanation of what's going on. It's all very, very terse. But just the way it's formatted and everything, I don't know why, but I found that I had difficulty finding things. It's a combination of that terseness and not having a lot of... I don't usually like a lot of images, but I like spacing and stuff to look a little different. Everything looks about the same, so I have to flip through the entire rulebook to try to find what's where. There is an index, and that's nice. Or table of contents, not an index. And that's kind of helpful. The counters, look, there's not a lot that has to go on these counters. They're functional. There were some issues with some of the colors being close to each other. I'm trying to think. Pakistan, Iraq looked kind of close to each other. I could see somebody having difficulty with that. But overall, I think the counters were fine as functional things. There's some weird symbols being used on them, like a triangle for complex terrain. And then there's combined arms units, which are marked as being... they have the symbol for armor, for mechanized infantry with an anchor over it. Whatever. It's too busy in the symbol. They could have just put the mechanized infantry and we would have been fine. They don't have any marine capabilities, as far as I can tell. But yeah, they're perfectly functional. They're nice and large. They wouldn't have to be this large, to be honest. But I know, my eyes are going bad and everything. And look, if some of the games have enough information on them that the counters need to, these have one value on them, right? The rest of the information is mostly unimportant except for the unit type symbol. So they're functional and fine. No gripes there at all. So let's talk about the system itself. The core of the system, there's only 10 turns in each game. Feels a little weird, but it's like, okay, how far can you get as the aggressor or whatever in this period of time? Fine. Other games like that, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like there should be something else. And essentially, you roll a pair of dice at the beginning of the turn. Each player rolls a pair of dice. They get to add, there's 4 cities that are important. 2 inside Russian territory, two that NATO controls. Unfortunately, the NATO ones are probably a little bit more exposed, especially Kuwait City. So the Russians, and I'm just going to call them the Russians, they're the Eurasian Union, the EU, but it feels like in the scenario I was playing, and maybe most of them, Iran is really the bigger faction, but less important. Anyway, Kuwait City is more exposed than any of the others. One of them is Incirlik in Turkey. That's a little bit closer, maybe, than the Russian stuff. I actually could have gotten to that. I couldn't have gotten to Kuwait City because the U.S. forces were too heavy across there. But anyway, so you're basically rolling 2 dice and adding 2. That's the number of action points you're going to have. Doesn't necessarily correlate to the number of actions you're going to use, but anyway. There's also the function of the shock marker. It doesn't give you an immediate advantage, except that, and the rules are contradictory here as far as I can see, but if you hold it at the beginning of the game, you get to choose who takes the first action. If, at least that's how I read it, if you activate it, as the second person who gets it, you then get the initiative, or second or later. The initiative switches. It's not really how the the rules are worded. The words are ruled, but it's the only way that you can make sense of how the rules are worded, and it's fucked up, is all I can say. The rules directly contradict one another, but whatever. The more specific stuff appears to say more what I expressed. Once you activate it, once you have it, no, once you get it as a player who didn't have it before and activate it, you now have that initiative advantage. Playing it gives you another advantage. It gives you a third die to roll for 1 turn, and it gives you a die roll worth of reinforcements that you can take from any of your contingents. It's not a big deal. The big deal of it is whoever got it first is 10 points in the hole in terms of victory points. So it's really a penalty to have it, but it does kind of indicate who's on the offensive, and they may have more forces or whatever available, but the token itself is not a 10-point advantage to have. It's relatively minor. All right, so whoever is chosen to go first then can either pass or take an action, and the action they can take probably costs 1 action point, but it may cost more. You do your action, and then the other player gets the option to pass or take an action. If both players pass in turn, the turn's over. If you run out of action points, the other player gets to spend theirs on consecutive actions, which is very, very powerful. So you might want to pass sometimes if you're running low on actions. Okay. There are units that are garrison units on the board. Basically, they never disappear. The goal is to flip them over. You flip them over by knocking everything out of the hex that they're in, either by destroying it or by forcing it to retreat. And then it flips over to your side. The strength on them can change. So the home country probably has a higher strength than an occupying country does. from them. Stacking is pretty much 1 unit per hex, 1 mobile unit. But you can stack with a garrison, you can stack with a base, which is something that adds strength points and is deployed on the board. It's an optional rule though. And then special forces and air units in the course of a combat can be in that same hex, but they're really just counters being pulled off the map, used for column shifts. You can pass through units that are on the board, but you can't overstack at the end of an action or phase. I kind of misplayed this. It actually does mean that you would be able to swap units in and out. But only hyperwar units. Okay. There's a limited fog of war, which is whatever special forces units you have, their values are always hidden. This is important because they're your secret bidding capability. They're somewhat trackable early in the game, but they can become untrackable, and it's really not a big deal that they're hidden. It's basically, I have this resource, you don't know how much of it I have, you don't know how much of it I'm going to bid. Okay, the reinforcement action, you declare a specific contingent, you roll a die, and you get that many units of that contingent. And those units, different units go in different places. So, special forces and air units go in your staging area. That means they're ready to use. Ground units go in specific locations, and sometimes you might not be able to bring stuff in because the locations that you're allowed to bring them in contain units, and you're not allowed to stack. Ground units that take a step loss. Oh, I did not see that. Can be recovered. And there's an optional rule that requires them to have a line of communication, well, a line of supply essentially, in order to do this. Basically, it takes your action, it costs. So, reinforcement takes an action. Regrouping a unit takes an action. It costs 2 action points if it's a hyperwar unit, just 1 otherwise, and I screwed that up. I was recovering hyperwar units for 1 as well. Whatever. Don't think it made much difference. I might not have chosen to regroup or take losses on certain things in that case. In the same rule is recycling, which is very, very different. So there's 2 different types of units that need to be recycled. They're not actions. They just happen when you use the unit. If you use special forces, you roll a die, and that special force will be available and ready to use, not in the reinforcement, but in the staging area, after that many turns. With air units, including missiles, using them throws them out of your staging area into your reinforcement area, so you'll have to do a reinforcement action to get them back online. You roll a die, you get X amount. You can see where a lot of randomness comes in here, and this is where air superiority comes in, is eventually you can trim down the air force of your enemy, if not their missile capability. And we see this is actually very nicely realistic, because the missile capabilities, like, we're finding that they don't really go away. There's stockpiles hidden and whatnot, right? What's deployed, if you knock that out, other missiles can be put into play. Movement. Alright. Movement is screwy. There are multiple different types of movement. They operate in different ways. But in general, you choose a unit to move, you roll a die or dice, and you get that many movement points. You move the unit, following terrain effects and everything like most war games. For regular ground units, you have to pay an action point, and you're allowed to move one unit. And it takes your action. Which means 2 regular units can't like swap position, even if one's a reserve in the backfields and the other one is kind of towards the front, whatever. There's zones of control that are locking for normal ground movement. But for your hyperwar units, just making sure I got this right. I believe you pay a single action point and can move all your hyperwar units. I'm looking this over, and it's actually not clear. It's on the action point chart. Let me make sure. Ugh. Sorry. Let's see what this is. Yeah, it's 1 point to move all your hyperwar units, and it's 1 action, which means you can very quickly deploy a hyperwar capable for a set of units. And this is not off a single contingent. It's all your contingents. So everything is linked up to the same automated system, whatever, communications capabilities, that is hyperwar. Now, not all NATO units, not all Russian units are hyperwar. Very few of them are. But there are a couple of things that are of other contingents that are hyperwar. Like, there's one Iranian guerrilla unit that is, which is kind of weird. There's also hyperwar special forces units, which don't move, get used as normal special forces units, but they can give any attack that's being done the hyperwar bonus, which we'll get to. Railroad movement, you pick a single contingent, and all units of that contingent can move by rail, but they can't enter or leave an enemy zone of control, which means that, yes, you can do a lot of background, out-of-the-way reshuffling, but you can't coordinate and prepare yourself for an attack. And that takes 1 action, 1 action point. Gonna have to pause here for a bit. Running into where there are no where I've got batteries that aren't charging that are out. Okay, so I'll try to move a little faster. For airborne units, you can move them as a hyperwar contingent, but they all have to move by the airborne movement capability, which is 2 dice, and they can kind of fly over any terrain at a 1 movement point. Now, this really bugs the shit out of me because air superiority has absolutely no effect on your ability to move airborne units around. They are just teleporting units. They're not actually in the air and able to be interdicted and everything. This is a problematic aspect of the game. Something that more detailed games take care of. This one doesn't. To some extent, it feels like this system, and remember, this is the second game of the system, was rushed out the door, and then they kept the system alive without fixing it too much. There are some minor fixes around the edges that they say, yeah, this should count for Putin moves south, whatever. It's a shame because I think there is something interesting here, but it feels like they copped out early on the first design of the system and then are just not really trying to fix it as a whole. Again, I'm guessing that the publication schedule prevented a more interesting and believable game from being released back in Putin Moves South. And then because it was appealing and because people were interested in the subject matter, whatever, I mean, this has a good rating. One I don't think it deserves, but it's not a bad game. Okay. So, like airborne movement, there's amphibious movement, which allows you to move from a port to another port. You don't have to be from a port to a coastal hex. And you have to be an amphibious unit. Hyperwars, as always, you can combine a bunch of hyperwar units for this type of movement for one movement point, but you'd have to have multiple Marines to do this, right? And there's limitations as to where you can do it. This is a lot less effective. I found the airborne to be very, very powerful, but it may be different on different scenarios. I might find there's certain scenarios where the Gulf itself is more important. The one I was playing, getting to Tehran was of some significant value. All right, so multiple different types of movement. Each has their own little rules, and you find yourself when you're using one that you're not used to using, having to look something up and see what's going on. Jesus. I just caught a bug. I don't know. I thought I had no chance of doing that, and I just did it. I'm impressed. It's probably a little slow, because it is chilly. Looked like it might have been a mosquito, but I don't know. Anyway, I don't know. It was something that doesn't belong in here. So, that I think is most of the movement. We might hit something else a little later. How does combat work? Combat, if you're adjacent to something, you can attack it. You have to pay it's one action to do a combat, i.e., you do one combat, then the other guy gets to do something. Which means that I move my pieces forward to engage you. You have a chance to move your pieces either out of danger or you might be able to put things near that. You might be able to swap two units. But for the most part, I give you a chance to react. And that chance to react might well be gathering reinforcements to get your air power back so that you can defend yourself very well. Just as every time that, I position myself for combat, you get some kind of reaction to it. Which might also be a threat to somewhere else that now I have to react to in some way. Might be reinforcing the unit if it's already reduced and you have the supplies or whatever for that, whatever. Okay. An attack costs one action, but it costs one action point per ground unit that's being involved in the attack. Ground units include airborne. However, all the hyperwar units that are involved collectively cost only one action point to use. You add up the combat factors, you get a combat odds table. Standard odds calculation. Okay. That's interesting. Well, Usually, the odds table is super important in a game, right? With the combat odds you have. They are of value here, but not the most important thing. The most important thing is the assets you can bring into play in a particular combat. Because air units are worth 1 or 2 column shifts each. NATO can put up to 3 air units into a single battle with close air support. Special forces are worth up to 3, but for the most part 1 column shift each. And they're done as a bidding situation. Both players secretly decide how many special forces they're putting in after everything else is determined. So you determine the odds. It's possible column shifts for terrain effects, for surrounding the enemy. And those are 1 column shift each max. Wait, major cities I think might be 2. Anyway. Air power. One side will generally be able, like the way I played it, I threw all my air power in to try to get air superiority. I managed to get it with NATO. The Russians did what they could to avoid it. That was stage 1. That's how modern warfare is generally fought, so I tried to follow that pattern. Maybe you can do something before that happens. But what it meant was NATO could basically get 6 column shifts off 3 of their 2-point planes on any attack that they wanted to. They'd have to set it up though, right? And then after, and that includes attacks by the Russians. They could, if they lose the initiative, they just start recuperating, recycling their planes and throwing them in on each defense and recycling them again, and that's just what they're using all their points for, if the Russians are taking the initiative. Which is much, much easier than taking the attack yourself. And then, so first you determine the odds, you do the shifts based on terrain and positioning. Shifts for the air power, maximum of 6 there. Russians can do a maximum of 4. If you're using some other air contingent, you're probably only going to get a point off them. But 6 column shifts, right? If we're talking about trying to get multiple units into play so that I can go from, say, a 1-to-1 to maybe a 3-to-1 attack, that's 2 column shifts. It's so much easier to get those 6 column shifts with air power than to position your units so that you have a good base odds. And that's an important facet in this. But then the worst of all is you can bid as much of your special forces as you like. You have a big pile of them, but they're a limited resource. They don't come back quickly. Those can be a lot of column shifts. I say they're mostly 1-pointers. There's some 2-pointers. There's like a 3-pointer. But you can basically go from and we had this happening regularly, 1 to 6 odds to 7 to 1 odds by just pushing a ton of special forces. You have a lot of them in the game as a whole, but they're a limited resource, and you have to make your decision. Towards the end of the game, everybody had all theirs in there, and this becomes this weird sort of guessing game where, because they're done secretly, right? Everything else was done in the open. The attacker chooses how much air power they're throwing in. The defender throws in how much close air support they want to throw in. You know the odds at that point. But then you make this secret bid that feels kind of like Dune, dialing putting your number on the dial in Dune. Except in Dune, you can pretty much look and say, "Oh, I'm going to lose. I might as well dial all my troops into it." But I digress from there. But it's a neat function. It really is, and I think would be really, really exciting in opposed play. Solitaire play. This was the thing that got me kind of in an ugly position, and I had to roll dice to determine. I made various decisions as to what was likely and rolled dice for those, and then learned things as I'm playing. And learned things about how my opponent is playing, etc. Even with the die rolls and whatnot, I could factor that kind of stuff in. So that was very exciting, but it only came down right at the very end because I tend to conserve resources. May not have been wise. The combat result tables themselves are kind of interesting. They're generally not too dramatic. If you're making like a 3-to-1 attack, you are probably going to either get a bloodbath, which is like an exchange, both sides lose a step, the defender loses a step, defender retreat, the hyper war, or nothing happens. The hyper war result is a nothing happens if you don't have a hyper war unit in it. If you have a hyper war unit in it, it's a pretty impressive result. It's a defender loses 1 and a defender retreats combined, which means you get the hex and you cause damage. It's pretty good. Now, at the higher ends, it's still not guaranteed that you take a hex. What I found, see, at 7-to-1, it's 50-50 that you take a hex. At 6-to-1, you got a 30% chance of taking a hex against a double stacked, against a 2-step unit defending in an important location. All the way down to 1-to-2, you have a 1/3 chance to take the hex. That was an interesting thing to find out. Not what I expected. I was in a position where taking the hex was what was important. We're going for final victory points here at the end of the game. And I saw, I'm just as good with 1-to-2 as I am with 6-to-1. Sure, some of the other results may not be as good, but for what I really needed to do, I have that same odds. And that means I can use a lot. That means that the amount of special forces I need to bid is maybe less important. Interesting thing, because they are the tight resource in the game in a lot of ways. All right, let's get to the air war, because the air war, and again, I think the cyber war and the whole hyper war concept should have been predicated on something similar to this air war. You should have some kind of resources. Now, the counter mix for this game was limited, okay? So they didn't have additional counter mix to make that extra whole cyber war type thing. They would have had to expend. Now Decision Games is able to do this. They sometimes print larger counter mixes, but I think, they want to cut costs here and there and whatever. And this game maybe got, and its predecessor maybe got kind of a short shift on that, and we're told, yeah, we can't really give you 50% more counters on this design. But it would have needed it, or something. Could have been, you get rid of the special forces, and you don't make counters for the cyber war, and instead what you use is you have a pool of points that you track. So it would only take a couple counters each to track these two things. But yeah, there were not, there are already 4 tracks on the game that do not have a counter for them. There's 2 game turn tracks. Why do you need 2? Both players have their own because their special forces go hidden on there as to when they return. It's also possible reinforcements show up on there. And then both players have their action point track. So there's no counters for any of that. So they were pressed on counters. I think a pool of points for special forces and a pool of points for cyber warfare would have been the way to go in order to stay within this counter mix. And then, you have, I don't know, you might have to have a different recycling method for those as to how they come back. I don't know. Like, whatever. All right. So let's go to the air operations system. You have a bunch of air units. Like I said, the big deal with them is you use them once, and this counts for missile units as well. You use them once, they fall into your reinforcements, so then you have to pay an action point to reinforce again to get your air units ready. And you can bring in some ground units and special forces in conjunction with that, but I saw the air superiority stage of the game as the most important thing to win first off. It's the only thing that works this way. You can use your air units for air superiority, bombardment, and close air support. We've already talked about close air support. That doesn't cost you anything, except that your air units are used by it and go back into your reinforcements, so you have to recycle them. Bombardment was pretty unimpressive. I did a couple of them because ground units are worth victory points in the game, but they're not worth a lot. And it was basically, hey, I'll throw some cruise missiles because that makes sense right now. I could see scenarios where there aren't a lot of ground units in the game and where you're doing something like the U.S. is currently doing in Iran, where bombardment would be an important facet, especially bombardment of physical assets, oil fields and whatnot. So that would be an aspect of the game that's also missing, which is this ability to take victory points away from a player by just denying them their resource rather than having to conquer it and try to hold it. It would be very different, but maybe more realistic than we're gonna conquer your military bases and your oil fields and whatnot. This, again, it feels like an Iraq war type of thing, which maybe made more sense in 2019, but probably not. Might have made sense in 2008 when you had McCain and Graham basically probably more advocating for that, although they were really more just into bombing shit. Anyway, the big thing that I wanted to do was the air superiority. Okay, what's neat about air superiority? Costs 1 action point. You can throw all your missiles and all your planes from all your contingents in. And I know this may sound weird, but it actually makes perfect sense. And you roll on this table. For every 6 that you have, you can roll on the 6 column. And then if you have any fraction left, you roll on the 1 through 4. Don't worry about the 0 column, that's for bombardment. Well, there's a few different results. The attacker can lose planes on this, which are actually eliminated. And basically, if you roll a 1, you're crapped out, and this could just keep happening, and you could lose air superiority, through this period. Your planes are gone. They're never coming back. They're dead. Okay. It is always possible, even over on the 0 table, to get an E result. it's equal to your A result on the 0 table, on the 1 table, on the 2 table, on the 3, not on the 3 table. Once you get at least 3 planes bombing, though, so like, it's kind of iffy to bomb with with extra planes. So like, if I had 8 planes, I have to roll on the 6 and the 2 table. I might not want to roll on the 2 table, but anyway, I might. The E result eliminates one of the defending planes, but it can be taken against a missile, which only puts it into the reinforcements. Defending player's choice there. The attacking player, I guess technically, should have to actually split their planes up. I did not do that. So any A results actually hit planes. I rolled it all and did it as a consolidated value. Maybe that's the more valid way. It's not absolutely clear here how you're supposed to do that. I think either way is valid. I kind of like the way I did it because it puts a risk on putting those planes in the air. A little bit more of one. Now, there's another type of result. The E's can go up to 3, by the way, which will kill 3 planes. But if you have 2 missiles and a bunch of planes as the defender, you can take your 2 missiles as losses into the reinforcement pool, and then you only lose 1 plane. And this was one of the facets of it, is that like the attacker is kind of, all their units are going into the reinforcements because they're getting used, and they're not really doing them. They're not really interdicting the air power that their enemy has to put into play when they do these counter-air results. So there is some argument for not going straight counter-air. I still think it's the way to go, that you want, because you want to eliminate the enemy's air power for the late part of the game. But there's also R results, which just recycle that number of enemy planes, defensive planes. And that is your kind of interdiction result, the flipping planes over a la Third Reich. Anyway, how does bombardment work? It uses the same table. Terrain effects are into play, so they can shift you down. It's possible to lose attacking air units, not missiles. Missiles are unaffected because they're going to recycle no matter what. And you can get 2 results. An E result off of here is a step loss. An R result is you force the unit to retreat that many spaces, which feels really, really weird. Like, oh, I got an R3. You're going to move from Tehran, 150 miles away or whatever. I don't know. What's the scale of these? I'm not very wise on this kind of stuff. Yeah. They're 62 miles a hex. So, yeah, nearly 200 miles away. I'm going to run that far away because you bombed me. When the reality is you probably could just go 10 miles down the road. You probably wouldn't have to leave the hex. All right, you can convince me that maybe I'm bombing supply sources or whatnot. A 1 hex retreat makes sense. 3 hex retreat doesn't make sense. They're just trying to reuse the same chart. It's goofy. It's goofy. There should be some kind of disruption result, stuff like that. Again, the game's not that complicated. Missiles I've already talked about a fair amount. Navies. Navies can be used for close air support in coastal hexes. The nice thing about them is they're hard to, they don't die from it, and sometimes it gets, well, first of all, you're only allowed 3 airplanes in a close air support. So the Navy can be thrown in. It's worth 2 points as well. So now you've gone from 6 column shifts to 8 from bombardments, from close air support bombardment. Anything too exciting in the optional rules, I don't know. Not terribly. They had I mean, I played with them all. I like them. I would suggest playing with them. But I don't know that they're really systems that you absolutely have to discuss. None of them seem to have a huge impact on the balance or the play of the game. One of them that's kind of cool is the line of supply. It requires the forward operating bases and all kind of stuff like that. It's cute. Look at the playthrough if you want to see, or the intro if you want to see how those work. I would suggest the playthrough because in the intro I'm not really grasping what the impacts are. So one of the late game playthroughs is probably a good idea. I found this system to be intriguing and kind of fun to play. Like I said, I warmed to it. I think there are huge flaws in the design of the game, though. Going from that initial concept of what the game was going to be to, hey, whatever you're doing with these hyperwar units, they kind of don't make sense, and you're not really representing the cyber war and the satellite side of things and the jamming and all that very well. I feel like that's another realm of capability, very much like air superiority, that could have been handled in the same sort of way. Get rid of the stupid bonus hyperwar stuff. Make that a capability that's really by contingent. You know, NATO, Israel, Russia, maybe not all of Russia, would have that capability. If they can maintain their command and control, if they're not jammed, if they're not cyber attacked, whatever. That would make things really interesting because then you're fighting on two realms, and maybe air power would come into the cyber war as well. You're fighting on two realms where you have to spend an action to try to degrade the opponent's capabilities, and you have to make a decision which one is the most important. Do you go for the cyber war first, or do you go for the air power? Now, is that really fair? Probably not. Here's why. Because the cyber war and the air power would probably be done in conjunction. It doesn't really make sense to use that action point thing, although from a gameplay perspective it might. There are things like the paratroopers, the airborne units, being able to operate without any air cover at all. Yeah, bullshit. That's just not going to happen. And I don't see an easy way of handling that, except that maybe you can't do airborne movement if the opponent... Yeah. I was going to say, if the opponent has any missiles or planes available to intercept. That feels too hard to cope with. Because the missiles can't really be knocked out. And you'd have to just keep knocking them out. But maybe that's the right move. Maybe that's the right move. Or you can't do it within X range or something like that. I don't know. Something should be there. It feels wrong that both sides are capable of inserting airborne stuff anywhere they like. It doesn't mean the units can't be used. They can be used as ground units. But it does mean that they shouldn't be able to just have the flexibility of movement, which is huge. Especially since most of the airborne units are hyperwar. And if NATO lost air superiority, they should not be able to do all the stuff they could with their airborne capabilities. Same thing would go with insertion of forces into bases, I would say. I would say that becomes harder. There's base-to-base air transport and stuff like that. Maybe that's an optional rule. But again, without air superiority, you're not going to get away with that. And that has to be in there somehow. The other facet is the game balance, which I feel not enough thought was put into. I think NATO has the edge across the board in this game. Maybe they should, in terms of their capabilities and everything. But I have a hard time seeing that they could have been stopped in the play that I did. I think I could have played my Russians a little better. I could have used my hyperwar units where they mattered more. Although they did get me points, and they might not have gotten me any points where they mattered. But they might have been able to keep, Tehran free. If they could have kept 2 of the bases free, it becomes a different game. But one of the stupidest things, first of all, 10 points for that damn shock marker. It's not worth 10 points. But that's baked into the scenarios. Scenario victory points maybe are arranged to fit with that, although it doesn't feel like it. Because, again, well, I don't know. There's a couple of scenarios where the Russians are holding the shock marker. That 10 extra victory points is huge. But the biggest thing of all is you roll a die to see who gets Iraq. And it's worth 9 victory points. And like the shock marker, I say it's 10 victory points, 9 victory points. That's a swing of 20 or 18 victory points. I mean, if the game was at all close, by the victory conditions that were set out and the shock marker and the forces that are aligned and everything, if it was at all close, an 18-point swing is ridiculous. We've got the... because it's not like Iraq isn't able to defend itself to some extent. Let me look at this. So, a draw is 0 to 4 difference. A marginal victory is 5 to 14. An operational victory is 15 to 24. You could go from a marginal victory to an by one side to an operational victory by the other, based only on the victory points that who had Iraq at the beginning has. Need to have something there. Give Iraq to somebody. Leave their victory points as they are, but charge the person who has Iraq with like 9 victory points against them. So they got to hold it to break even, or something like that. They probably can. Maybe make it 8 victory points. I don't know. Maybe give them a bonus. But the fact that they just get a free 9 victory points, is stupid. It's stupid. Because you get victory points for everything you hold. And, that's just an idiotic piece of the design. So, what do I say? I've got a lot of gripes about the game, but it is kind of fun to play, and it feels like it's on the edge of something that could have been very, very cool. I'm not a huge fan of Joe Miranda's games in the past, but he does have interesting ideas. And when we take a look maybe at the Ancient Wars stuff that he did, which I know was very popular, we may see the same kind of stuff, where it's like some really cool ideas were like come up with here, but they didn't quite hit. They didn't quite do it. Certainly with this one I feel that way. I'm not so sure with some of the others. I've played those games. I felt bored, and I felt that they were dull games compared to this, which felt exciting. This felt like it would be fun to play opposed. Although, again, I don't buy the premise, and I don't feel like this hyperwar thing, whatever it's meant to represent, was done correctly. I think that could have been better handled with some kind of command and control, cyber war, space war capabilities that are similar to the superiority you're getting on the air war. And maybe you can do both in conjunction off the same action point. Maybe not. I would say that it makes sense that NATO has the air superiority, but the balancing factor may be probably to slightly over value what Russia and Iran's cyber capabilities would be. But the actual command and control that NATO is able to deploy has definitely been shown to be better than what the Russians are capable of, and certainly the Iranians and other states. So a lot of interesting stuff comes in there. And while Russia might be more capable in the cyber realm, Iran is no slouch, okay? Just like they have a lot of special forces, but they don't have a lot of air power, they might actually be an interesting value in the cyber war capability, however that's being tracked and used. I feel like that would have been a much more interesting and believable game than what's played. And hyperwar capability is something that maybe is an asset again that has to be used as a resource to be aligned to use with units, and you could only use it for certain contingents. So, for example, NATO might have X amount of hyperwar capability, which just allows almost all of their units to be able to be used in that sort of way. But they'd have to spend those capabilities. And those capabilities would be the targets, perhaps, or some of the targets of the cyber war. The game might bog down way too much into the cyber war aspects, is what I'm worried about here. That might be another place, though, where bidding could be done, much as that would make it not any fun for solo at all. But something, I'm thinking kind of like Time War here, where you're devoting resources. You're devoting, so much to the hyperwar side of things, so much, and here points work fine, so much to offensive interdiction and so much to defensive to prevent the interdiction for going through. And then comparisons and some die rolls might allow you to something that would be kind of interesting. Now, I don't think, unlike planes, it's hard to say that the cyber warfare capability, that much of it would be able to be destroyed for the length of the scenario. But it might be utilized somewhat like the special forces are, where it's offline for a significant amount of time. So and again, whatever mechanism is used for the special forces, if you're making them trackable as points on tracks, instead of as counters, and you're doing the same with the cyber war, you would have the same kind of mechanisms for recycling on them. And I think I can see something that would work pretty well. But anyway, the game as is has its definite flaws, but it's still kind of a kick to play. I just think it didn't. The real, like, the vision for the design is where it kind of feels like it fell apart. Like, it's got cool shit, but it didn't follow that cool shit to its sort of obvious conclusion, at least to me. Anyway, that's that.